They say power never dies, it just changes hands. Tonight I want you to close your eyes and listen. Listen to the footsteps echoing from 3 different worlds: Harlem's jazzlit streets, Boston's frozen alleys, and the sunburned hills of Sicily. 3 men. 3 kingdoms. Each built on silence, fear, and the belief that they could outsmart time itself. Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, the gentleman gangster who ruled Harlem with charm and iron. James Whitey Bulger, the Irish ghost who turned the FBI into his shield. And Salvatore Toto Riina, La Belva, the beast of Sicily who made an island kneel. They lived in different eras, spoke different tongues, but all chased the same thing: control. So dim the lights. Let the world fade away. You're about to drift through the lives of 3 men who built empires out of fear. And discovered what it costs to be king. He was born in the deep red soil of South Carolina in 1905, where the air carried the scent of cotton and old anger. His name was Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, but the streets would one day call him Bumpy. Back then, though, he was just another boy running barefoot through dust, watching the world through the slats of poverty and pride. His father worked long hours at a lumber mill, his back bending under sun and debt, yet never once breaking. His mother kept their home spotless and quiet, believing that dignity began with order, even if the world outside their door refused to see them as human. The boy learned early that silence could speak louder than words, and that in their corner of the South, silence often meant survival. One afternoon, while helping his father stack timber, he saw something that carved itself into his memory forever. A white foreman shouted, accused his father of moving too slow, then raised a cane and struck him across the shoulder. His father didn't fight back. He just stood there, still as stone, his jaw locked in something between pain and pride. The air around them turned heavy, as if even the cicadas stopped to watch. Bumpy felt a chill crawl up his spine, not from fear, but from the unbearable knowledge that the world could humiliate a man for the sin of standing tall. He didn't cry. He just stared, memorizing every heartbeat of that moment, vowing somewhere deep inside that he would never again bow his head for anyone. That night, as his father smoked in silence and his mother whispered prayers, young Ellsworth sat by the window and watched the lightning crawl across the Carolina sky. In that blue-white flicker of light, he made himself a promise. One day they'll look me in the eye. Years passed and the boy grew sharper, quieter, older than his age. He watched people the way others read books, studying every pause, every smirk, every twitch of hesitation. He learned that information was a weapon, that respect could be earned not through strength, but through understanding how power worked. Yet in South Carolina, power was something he could never truly touch. The rules were already written, and men like his father were expected to obey them. But the world was changing. Up north, they said, there was a place where black men walked in fine suits, where poets filled cafes and jazz spilled from the windows, where names could rise from dirt to gold. They called it Harlem. When his older brother Willie wrote home about the city, about how it buzzed with opportunity and danger in equal measure, Bumpy knew his time had come. He packed 2 shirts, a pocket Bible and the photograph of his mother, and boarded the northbound train. The journey was long, rattling, filled with weary faces and whispered hopes. Families clutched luggage like lifelines. Children stared at the passing fields as if they were watching their old lives slip away. Bumpy kept to himself, the rhythm of the train matching the steady drumbeat of his thoughts. Every turn of the wheels pulled him closer to something he couldn't name: freedom, maybe, or destiny. When he stepped onto 125th Street in 1919, Harlem hit him like a revelation. The air was alive, heavy with perfume, smoke, gasoline, and dreams. Brass bands spilled from open doors. Men strutted in double-breasted suits and women shimmered in silk, their laughter cutting through the noise like champagne bubbles. Harlem was motion itself, elegant, electric, merciless. It was the opposite of everything he'd known, and yet it felt like home. He moved in with Willie, who shared a cramped room above a tailor shop. "Keep your head down," his brother warned. "Harlem's got teeth. Smile at the wrong man and you'll bleed for it." But Bumpy had no intention of keeping his head down. He wanted to be seen. He wanted to walk into a room and make the air change. He worked odd jobs, shining shoes, sweeping bar floors, carrying crates for store owners who never learned his name. But at night, when his shift ended, he wandered the streets and watched. He stood outside the Savoy Ballroom, where men and women danced like they'd forgotten gravity. He leaned against lampposts and listened to the saxophones wail through the fog. In those sounds he heard freedom, not the kind written about in books but the kind men fought for with fists and wit. One evening, outside a smoky bar on Lenox Avenue, He witnessed his first Harlem lesson. A drunk gambler had lost money he didn't have. The collector, a local hustler named Shine, pulled a knife, thin and silver under the streetlight. The crowd took a step back the way people always do when blood is coming. But Bumpy didn't move. He saw the moment before the blade came down, that half-second of hesitation that separates predator from prey, and he acted. He stepped forward, calm, silent, caught Shine's wrist mid-swing and twisted. The knife clattered onto the pavement. For a moment the whole street froze. Then Shine laughed, rubbing his wrist. "Kid's got nerve," he said. And just like that Harlem noticed him. Not with applause but with curiosity. The kind that says, maybe this one's different. In the weeks that followed, people began calling him by his new name, Bumpy, a tease at first for the bump on the back of his head he'd had since birth. But soon it stopped being a joke. It became a signature. He moved like someone who knew where he was going even when he didn't. The street vendors nodded when he passed. The doorman remembered his face. Harlem was full of men trying to be kings, but only a few had that quiet gravity that made others step aside. Bumpy had it. At night, when he lay in bed listening to the city hum below his window, he thought of his father, of that day in the field, of the cane striking flesh, of humiliation turned to silence. He knew he would never let that silence define him again. Harlem wasn't the end of his journey, it was the beginning of a new game. And for the first time in his life the pieces were his to move. Outside, a trumpet wailed into the fog, lonely and defiant. Bumpy smiled into the dark. The city was his classroom now, and he was ready to learn. Harlem, 1920s. The city pulsed like a heartbeat beneath a neon sky. Every block had its rhythm. Jazz clubs, smoke-filled bars, street preachers shouting sermons about salvation that no one believed in. By day men worked. By night they gambled, hustled, dreamed. And somewhere between those two worlds, Bumpy Johnson was learning how to rule. He was no longer the barefoot boy from South Carolina. The city had changed him, not by teaching him cruelty, but by showing him the currency of respect. Harlem respected power, but it worshipped intelligence. And Bumpy had both. He started small, running numbers for neighborhood operators, collecting bets written on slips of paper no bigger than matchbooks. The work was dangerous but quick, a system built on faith and fear. Every day money flowed through Harlem like blood through a vein, and everyone wanted a piece of it. But above them all sat one woman, Madame Queen Stephanie St. Clair. She was legend and rumor all at once. The queen of Harlem numbers, dressed in silk and pearls, sharp as a blade beneath perfume. Men feared her more than they feared the police. When Bumpy first saw her, it was from across a smoky cafe on 139th Street. She sat like a monarch, a cigarette balanced between her fingers, watching her lieutenants argue over territory. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. When her eyes moved, men shut up mid-sentence. Bumpy admired that. He understood her power instantly. It wasn't built on noise or muscle, but on precision. She played Harlem like a chessboard, every block a square, every man a pawn. When he finally got a chance to work under her, it felt less like a job and more like a calling. The queen saw potential. "You think before you move," she told him one night, pouring herself a glass of gin. "That's what separates a hustler from a boss. Remember that." And he did. Under her watch, Bumpy learned the unspoken rules of Harlem's underground. Never show fear. Never trust flattery. And always know the room you're standing in. By day he read newspapers and books she lent him, Machiavelli, Dubois, Sun Tzu, lessons in power disguised as philosophy. By night he handled collections, negotiations and quiet cleanups when deals went wrong. It didn't take long for his reputation to grow. He wasn't the loudest man in the room, but people listened when he spoke. He carried himself with that calm tension of someone who understood that silence could be a weapon. When trouble came he settled it fast, sometimes with words, sometimes without. But Harlem was never peaceful for long. By 1931, Dutch Schultz, a white mobster from the Bronx, decided Harlem's numbers racket was too rich to belong to black operators. He sent his men south with orders to negotiate. They came with guns, not words. A few shop owners disappeared. A few bookies were found in alleys, their pockets turned inside out. Fear began to creep down Lenox Avenue. Madame Queen refused to bow. "This is our turf," she said. "Our people. No one takes from Harlem but Harlem." And behind her, Bumpy stood silent, watching, calculating. He knew Schultz wasn't a man of patience. He was a man of hunger. But hunger made people sloppy. Bumpy began setting traps, turning small corners of Harlem into fortresses of loyalty. He visited shop owners, offered protection at no cost. "You don't owe me," he'd say softly, "you owe yourself." One evening he sat in a dim cafe across from one of Schultz's lieutenants. The man was sweating, eyes darting to the door. "You people don't understand," he said. "Dutch doesn't talk, he orders." Bumpy leaned forward, voice low, steady. "Tell him Harlem doesn't kneel. We don't fold. He can bring fire if he wants. But he'll leave with ashes." The man stared at him, then nodded, not out of respect but out of fear disguised as understanding. Bumpy watched him leave, then turned back to the chessboard in front of him. He'd been playing quietly during the conversation, moving black pieces one at a time. He smiled at the board, the white king cornered, trapped. "Checkmate," he whispered. Weeks turned into months. Harlem became a war zone without headlines. Drive-bys, bribes, disappearances, all conducted in silence. Bumpy was everywhere and nowhere. Some said he could walk through danger untouched. Others said he never walked alone. Both were true. He began wearing tailored suits, hats with wide brims and a small cane, not for vanity but as a symbol. People started calling him Mr. Johnson. The Queen's influence stretched, but so did Schultz's fury. In 1935, it reached breaking point. A shootout erupted near 142nd Street. Schultz's men ambushed one of Madame Queen's collectors. Bumpy arrived minutes later, smoke still hanging in the air. He walked past the bodies, past the blood on the pavement, and knelt beside the wounded survivor. "Who ordered it?" he asked. "Dutch," the man rasped. "He wants the whole board." Bumpy stood, eyes cold, voice almost gentle. "Then we'll show him what happens when you play a game you don't understand." Days later, Schultz was dead, gunned down in Newark, his empire collapsing overnight. Some said it was a rival mob. Others whispered it was Harlem's hand that guided the trigger. Bumpy never confirmed either way. He just said, "The Queen sleeps better now." But victory always has a price. After Schultz's death, the Italian mob began circling Harlem, offering peace in exchange for control. The Queen refused and soon the police came knocking. Raids, arrests, headlines. Harlem's power shifted again, this time quieter, subtler. Bumpy watched from the sidelines as the Queen's empire strained under pressure. One night, she poured herself another drink and said, "You're smarter than this city, Bumpy. But smarts don't save you forever. Sooner or later you'll have to choose, crown or conscience." He said nothing. Just nodded. Because deep down he already knew. The crown always wins. When she was finally taken away, handcuffed but unbroken, Bumpy stood on the sidewalk, hat low, watching the car vanish into the Harlem night. He didn't smile. He didn't move. He just thought about the chessboard. The Queen was gone. The board was empty. And somewhere in that silence he realized, it was his turn to play. By the time the 1940s rolled through Harlem, Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson was no longer just a name whispered in alleyways. He was a presence. The kind of presence that made even the air behave differently when he entered a room. His suits were sharp, his cane polished, his words deliberate. To some, he was a criminal. To others, a savior. But to Harlem he was both, its reflection and its protector. The war had changed the city. Men had gone overseas, women had taken their place behind counters and in factories. Money moved differently now, quicker, dirtier. The old codes were fading. But Bumpy, ever the strategist, adapted. He saw that Harlem wasn't just about territory anymore, it was about influence. The Italians were expanding north, running heroin through the veins of the city like poison through an artery. Bumpy wanted no part of that. He believed the streets should never destroy their own. "You don't poison the people who feed you," he used to say. "That's not business. That's suicide." He ruled with rules, unwritten but sacred. No violence near schools. No cheating the elderly. No theft from the community that gave you shelter. It wasn't morality. It was logic. A kind of code that made Harlem his chessboard and every man a player who knew the cost of disobedience. He began frequenting Small's Paradise, the classiest spot on 135th Street. It wasn't just a nightclub, it was his court. Jazz musicians played for him, poets toasted him, politicians shook his hand in public but whispered his name in private. He could walk into any room in Harlem and know exactly who owed him, who feared him, and who would die for him. And yet he never raised his voice. He didn't have to. Sometimes, when younger men came to him for advice, they expected talk of guns and money. Instead he handed them books. Plato, Marcus Aurelius, Dostoevsky. "You can't outshoot stupidity," he'd say. "But you can outthink it." That was his gift, the fusion of intellect and intimidation. He'd sit in the corner of a smoky cafe, reading philosophy while a gun rested quietly in his coat pocket. But even intellect can't escape inevitability. Power attracts enemies, not just from the streets but from within. The police had never stopped watching him. They raided his clubs, harassed his associates, tried to catch him with enough evidence to cage him for good. But Bumpy was careful. Too careful. He had a lawyer for every problem and a favor for every lawyer. He walked between legality and crime like a man balancing on a wire, never flinching. And yet, in 1952 the wire snapped. A sting operation caught him in possession of narcotics. A setup, some said, orchestrated by jealous rivals and corrupt cops. But Harlem knew better. They said they couldn't outsmart him, so they buried him. The trial was swift, the sentence long, 10 years. When the cell door clanged shut, the city seemed to dim a little. Harlem without Bumpy was like a stage without its leading man. But he didn't crumble. Prison became another classroom. He read everything he could get his hands on: law, politics, literature. He wrote letters to his wife, Mamie, describing the world as if he were still out there walking its streets. In one letter he wrote, "They think iron bars can cage a mind. But a man's thoughts are the only thing they can't fingerprint." Other inmates feared him at first, then followed him. He organized reading circles, taught chess, mediated disputes between gangs. The guards called him the Professor. Some nights, he'd stare at the concrete ceiling and imagine Harlem's skyline. The glow of the Apollo, the laughter spilling from Lenox Avenue, the hum of streetlights after rain. He missed it like a heartbeat. When he was finally released in 1963, the world had changed again. Harlem was different, angrier, hungrier. The civil rights movement was roaring through America, and young men now spoke of revolution instead of respect. To them, Bumpy was a relic, a figure from another era. But the streets hadn't forgotten. When he stepped out of prison, people lined the sidewalks, clapping softly, like welcoming home a myth. He went straight back to his old routines, but the rhythm felt off. The heroin he'd once fought to keep out was now everywhere. The Italians no longer needed permission. Kids he used to mentor now dealt poison on corners he once controlled. The new generation didn't understand his code, they only understood chaos. Still Bumpy tried. He brokered peace between warring crews, protected small businesses, and kept his ear to the ground. At night, he'd sit by his apartment window, cigarette glowing in the dark, watching Harlem move, slower now, heavier. Mamie would ask, "What are you thinking about?" And he'd say, "I'm thinking about how fast time runs when you're trying to slow it down." One evening he was invited to Small's Paradise again. Same tables, same jazz, but fewer familiar faces. He laughed with old friends, spoke softly to new ones, and seemed for a while like the man he'd always been, unshaken, unafraid. Then, as the story goes, while eating a plate of shrimp and grits, he paused mid-sentence, placed a hand on his chest and fell still. No gunfire. No enemies. No spectacle. Just a quiet end to a loud legend. They said when he died, Harlem itself held its breath. The next morning, the newspapers printed his name like a headline from another age. But in the neighborhood they didn't mourn him with tears. They told stories. About the man who walked both sides of the law with equal grace. About the gangster who quoted poets. About the gentleman who made Harlem proud, even in sin. That night, the jazz played softer than usual. And if you walked down Lenox Avenue, past the lamplight and the steam rising from the manholes, you might have sworn you saw him. The tilt of his hat, the gleam of his cane, the shadow of a smile fading into the dark. Because legends like Bumpy don't die. They just step off the board when the game is done. There's a moment in every empire when the streets stop echoing your name. The phone rings less, the crowds thin out, and even the shadows seem to forget your shape. For Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, that moment came quietly, not with sirens, not with betrayal, but with the slow, suffocating fate of time itself. It was 1966, and Harlem was changing faster than the trains that rattled beneath it. The rhythm had shifted, the jazz clubs closing one by one, replaced by cheap bars and needle houses. Young men who once wore pressed suits now slouched on corners, their eyes glassy, their pockets full of powder. Heroin had turned the community into prey. And the new hustlers didn't play chess. They played roulette, reckless, loud, impatient. Bumpy watched it all from his window on 115th Street, cigarette smoke curling into the night. He'd built his kingdom on rules, respect, restraint, balance, but rules meant nothing to men who mistook chaos for courage. Every day he'd see another young body dragged into an alley, another mother crying on the curb. He'd shake his head and mutter, "They want to be kings but they don't want to earn the crown." His wife, Mamie, would sit beside him sometimes, reading quietly while he stared out the window. She was grace in a world without much of it. "You can't save Harlem forever," she told him. "It'll change with or without you." He smiled faintly. "I ain't trying to save it," he said. "I'm just trying to remind it what it used to be." By then the Italians had taken most of the trade. The heroin flowed in from the docks, and even some of Bumpy's old allies were now in their pockets. He could feel the walls closing in, not from the police but from irrelevance. He was an old man in a young man's game. But he refused to fade quietly. One night, he met with a few of the new Harlem dealers at a diner on 145th Street. The air smelled of coffee and burnt toast, the kind of place where men talked softly and left fast. The boys sat across from him, restless, tapping their fingers, smirking like wolves who thought they'd cornered an old lion. Bumpy leaned on his cane, his eyes steady. "You boys think you're building something," he said. "But what you're really doing is burning the house we built, just to feel the fire." One of them laughed. "Times changed, old man. You had your run. This is our Harlem now." Bumpy didn't move. He just studied the boy's face, the kind of face that had never known discipline, never known loss. Then he said softly, "If Harlem belongs to you, then why does it look like this?" The laughter died. The silence that followed was heavier than any threat. Because deep down even they knew he was right. He left a few dollars on the counter, stood and walked into the rain. Outside the city looked tired. The same streets he'd once ruled now felt unfamiliar, smaller somehow, as if they'd shrunk to fit the ambitions of lesser men. In the months that followed, he tried to make peace with the world's new rhythm. He visited schools, funded local churches, even helped a few families pay rent. The people still respected him, not out of fear but out of memory. To them he wasn't just a gangster. He was Harlem itself, the part that refused to bow even when the world demanded it. But inside, Bumpy felt the clock ticking louder each day. The nights grew longer. His chest ached more often. Sometimes he'd wake before dawn, the city still asleep, and think about his father, the man who'd once been beaten for standing tall. He'd whisper into the dark, "You see, Pop? I made them look me in the eye." He knew he'd lived long enough to become a myth. And myths, he thought, don't get to rest. They just fade until someone remembers them again. The end came the way all quiet endings do, unannounced. It was a July evening, 1968. Bumpy was at Wells' restaurant, sitting with friends, laughing softly over a plate of shrimp and grits. The jazz band played something smooth in the background, and for a moment, it almost felt like the old days, Harlem glowing, the air thick with perfume and pride. He lifted his fork, started a sentence, and never finished it. A single gasp, a hand clutching his chest, a glass tipping over. Then stillness. No drama. No last words. Just silence. When the news spread, Harlem froze. Cars stopped mid-street, music halted mid-song. The queen of Harlem was gone, the king was gone, and the streets whispered like mourners at a wake. At his funeral, the church overflowed. Politicians, poets, hustlers, housewives, all came to pay respects. Some wept openly. Others stood stiff, heads bowed, unsure how to grieve a man who'd walked the line between sinner and saint. Mamie sat quietly in the front row, her hands folded over her lap. When a reporter asked what kind of man her husband really was, she said, "The kind who wanted better for his people, even when he went about it the wrong way." After the service, as the coffin was carried out onto the Harlem streets, the crowd fell silent. A few men tipped their hats. A woman hummed a blues tune under her breath. And somewhere far off, a trumpet played, low, slow, mournful. For weeks after, people swore they still saw him. Standing on corners, walking under the lamplight, ghosting through the fog like he was checking on things. Because legends don't vanish, they linger. They wait for someone to tell their story right. And Harlem never forgot him. Even now, when the rain hits Lenox Avenue and the streetlights flicker, some say you can still hear the soft tap of his cane on the pavement. A rhythm keeping time with the heart of a city he once ruled, a heartbeat that refuses to die. The snow never really melts in South Boston. It turns gray, hardens, and clings to the gutters like something that refuses to die. The people there are the same, tough, quiet, suspicious of anyone who doesn't belong. It was in that frozen neighborhood, among the row houses and cracked sidewalks, that James Joseph Bulger Jr. learned what survival meant. To most, he was just another Irish kid with cold eyes. To the few who knew him well, he was a storm waiting for a reason. He was born in 1929, the year America's dreams went broke. His father lost his arm in an accident and never found steady work again. His mother, a sharp and devout woman, kept the family upright with prayers and pride. The Bulgers had 7 children crammed into a small apartment overlooking the harbor, where the wind carried both salt and the stench of industry. Poverty was normal, hope was rationed. But young Whitey, the nickname came later for the pale hair that glowed in the sun, wasn't built to accept smallness. He fought his way through childhood, fists first, questions later. Teachers called him smart but uncontrollable. Cops called him trouble before he was old enough to shave. And his friends, the kids from the projects, called him fearless because they'd never seen him hesitate. By 13 he was running errands for the neighborhood bookies. By 16 he was boosting cars and breaking locks. The church bells rang every Sunday, but their hymns never reached the corners where he stood. Southie's moral code was simple: protect your own, distrust outsiders, and never, ever talk to the cops. Whitey followed that code to the letter, or so everyone thought. One winter night, after a fight behind a bar, he sat on the curb with a split lip, staring at the blood in the snow. It looked almost beautiful, like a red mirror reflecting what he already knew, that the world didn't reward good men. It rewarded survivors. And he intended to survive. He spent his teenage years testing the system. Small arrests, short stints, nothing that stuck. But by his early 20s he'd gone from petty hustler to something more dangerous. A man who understood how power worked when the law turned a blind eye. He joined the Air Force for a while, tried to go straight, even managed to charm his way through service without getting thrown out. But the quiet life never fit him. He came home from the military sharper, meaner, with a sense that he'd been playing in the wrong league. Boston in the 1950s was a city split by bloodlines. The Irish ruled Southie, the Italians ruled the North End, and between them sat a river of silence. Whitey didn't care about borders, only leverage. He ran small rackets, loan sharking, gambling, the kind of crimes that built reputations one favor at a time. But unlike the loudmouths who wanted fame, he worked in whispers. His reputation wasn't carved in fear, it was breathed in it. One by one the small-timers started working for him. Not because they wanted to, but because it was safer than saying no. He had that look, calm, unreadable, the kind of face that made you second-guess your next word. When he smiled, people relaxed. When he didn't, they panicked. The cops knew his name, but they couldn't touch him. He was always one step ahead, always out of reach. And yet, there was one truth about men like Whitey: the higher they climb, the more invisible the noose becomes. His first real fall came in 1956. An armored truck robbery gone wrong, one of those wild jobs that sound brilliant in bars and suicidal in daylight. He got caught. The sentence was long, 20 years. The judge looked down at him and said, "You're too smart for this life." Whitey just smirked. "Then maybe this life's too dumb for me." He was sent to Alcatraz, the Rock, the coldest, hardest prison America could build. Most men broke there. He didn't. The guard said he was quiet, disciplined, almost polite. But behind that calm, something darker was sharpening. He spent his nights reading military strategy, memorizing guard rotations, and studying human behavior like a textbook. Other inmates said he had eyes that never blinked. There were rumors, experiments, LSD trials run by the government on willing inmates. Some said Whitey volunteered. Others said he didn't. Either way, something changed in him after that. When he finally got out years later, those who knew him swore he wasn't the same. The man who'd gone in angry came out, calculated. He returned to South Boston to find the old gangs fractured and leaderless. The Italians had grown bolder, the cops dirtier, the streets colder. And Whitey, with his quiet mind and careful rage, saw opportunity everywhere. He met with the remnants of the Irish crews, men who still fought over barrooms and pride. "You're thinking too small," he told them. "Stop worrying about respect. Start thinking about control." They didn't understand it yet, but he wasn't talking about the streets. He was talking about the city itself. It was around this time that he began to see himself differently. Not as a criminal, but as a corrector. Someone who understood that order came from fear and fear came from consistency. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't even particularly greedy. He just believed that rules should be written by those willing to enforce them. Late one night he walked the frozen docks alone. The harbor wind bit through his coat, the lights of the city blinking like distant stars. Somewhere behind him, a ship horn groaned across the black water. He thought about all the men who'd called him crazy, about the judges, the cops, the priests. He smiled to himself and whispered, "They don't know what's coming." Because in his mind, it had already begun. The quiet conquest of Boston, one favor, one corpse, one handshake at a time. The snow in Southie never stopped falling. It just learned to hide, ground into slush by tires, frozen into corners like memory. In that endless winter, James Whitey Bulger began building something colder than the streets themselves. An empire built on fear, silence, and understanding exactly what made people break. He came home from prison a different man. The swagger was gone, replaced by precision. The boy who used to fight in alleys now spoke softly, thought carefully, and killed rarely, but when he did, it meant something. South Boston wasn't ready for that kind of discipline. The old gangs, Winter Hill, Mullins, Killeen, were fractured, tired. Men who'd once ruled bars now spent their nights drunk, bragging about past glories. Whitey watched, listened, waited. He knew better than to announce himself. Kings who declare themselves don't last. The smart ones let the crown come to them. He started small, just as he had in Harlem years before, running bets, collecting debts, protecting neighborhoods. But his protection didn't come cheap. It came with rules. No stealing from locals. No noise that brings cops. And no betrayal. Ever. Within months, the streets began to quiet. The chaos that had once defined Southie started to move in rhythm with him. Men followed not because they loved him but because they feared disappointing him. It was something new, loyalty born not from friendship but from awe. Whitey was meticulous. He knew every bar owner, every cop, every priest. He remembered their birthdays, their habits, their secrets. He once told an associate, "Information isn't power, it's insurance." He gathered it like a collector gathers art. But even the smartest men need allies, and Whitey found his in an unlikely place, the FBI. It began with a man named John Connolly, an ambitious young agent who'd grown up in Southie idolizing the Bulgers. Whitey's younger brother, Billy Bulger, was already climbing the political ladder, soon to become one of the most powerful men in Massachusetts. Between family, politics, and old neighborhood ties, the connection was inevitable. Connolly approached Whitey with a deal: information for protection. He'd feed the FBI intelligence about the Italian mob, the North End crews, in exchange for a long leash on his own operations. On paper it was business. In reality it was treason, a partnership that blurred the line between law and the lawless. Whitey agreed. Not because he trusted Connolly but because he understood him. Ambition is predictable. Loyalty isn't. And so began one of the strangest relationships in American crime. The gangster who worked with the law to destroy his rivals. It was perfect. The FBI got their headlines: Irish mobster helps feds battle Cosa Nostra. Whitey got protection, an invisible shield that made him untouchable. The Italians fell one by one, their crews dismantled, their leaders arrested. And every time one disappeared, Whitey's reach grew longer. Winter Hill was no longer a gang. It was an organization. He ran it like a corporation, precise, hierarchical, and emotionless. Beneath him were captains, enforcers, errand boys, each with a role, each with a fear. He enforced silence with elegance. A single warning. A second chance. Then a body in the marshes outside Quincy. But what set Whitey apart wasn't just his violence, it was his calm. He didn't shout, didn't gloat. He'd sit across from a man in a bar, sipping beer, and say quietly, "You're done." And the man would nod, finish his drink, and never be seen again. He believed in control through atmosphere. He once said, "Fear's like fire, let it spread too fast, it burns you too." So he kept it measured. Enough to remind everyone who ruled South Boston, but never enough to make the city revolt. By the mid-1970s, Winter Hill ran everything that mattered: bookmaking, loans, protection, labor unions. Whitey's profits flowed through clean channels: real estate, trucking, even churches. The priests didn't ask questions. The politicians didn't either. At night, he'd drive alone through the city, headlights off, the skyline flickering across the windshield. He didn't dream of power, he already had it. He dreamed of order, of a city that finally moved the way he thought it should. But even kings grow paranoid when their thrones are built on deals with devils. Connolly, the FBI agent, began feeding Whitey more than protection. He fed him names. Informants, witnesses, enemies. One by one they vanished. The bureau looked the other way. After all, results mattered more than morals. As long as Italian bodies were piling up, nobody questioned how. But inside the FBI's concrete walls, the whispers began. Bulger's untouchable. He's killing with a badge. Connolly brushed it off, but the seed was planted. Whitey noticed too. He knew that partnerships built on secrets don't last forever, especially when both sides keep ledgers. One night, Connolly met him at a bar on L Street. The air smelled of stale beer and old wood. They sat in the corner booth, their conversation low and careful. "You're getting attention," Connolly warned. "People upstairs are asking questions." Whitey smiled. "Then tell them what they want to hear." You can't keep this up forever, Jimmy. He leaned forward, eyes cold, voice soft. Forever's overrated. I just need long enough. He meant it. Over the next few years, the FBI files on Whitey grew thicker, but so did his influence. He owned half the cops, scared the rest, and made sure every rumor about him was half true, just enough to keep people guessing. He lived simply, almost monk-like. A small apartment, plain clothes, no luxury. His only indulgence was paranoia. He changed cars weekly, switched apartments monthly, used code words for everything. But no matter how careful he was, the walls were closing. Some of his men were getting sloppy, drinking too much, talking too loud. One night, a young enforcer named Brian Halloran whispered the wrong name to the wrong person. Whitey found out within a day. They met in a parking lot near the harbor. Halloran pleaded. It wasn't me, Jimmy. I swear. Whitey sighed. I know, he said gently. You just forgot who you're talking to. The gunshot echoed across the water like a punctuation mark on a lesson already learned. Whitey left no witnesses, no fingerprints, no remorse. The next morning he fed the seagulls near Castle Island, humming to himself while police dragged the harbor for clues. South Boston became quiet again. Too quiet. People stopped saying his name. They called him the man. No last name needed. Everyone knew who they met. But at night, when he sat alone in his apartment, he sometimes heard the echoes, not of fear but of inevitability. The same thing that haunted every man who thought he could rewrite the rules. Because deep down even Whitey knew, power borrowed from the law can't last forever. The snow outside his window fell soundless, thick, heavy, blanketing Southey like a confession no one would ever make. He poured himself a drink, stared into the glass and said to no one, You don't build empires in snow. They melt. Then he smiled, the kind of smile that meant he already had a plan for when it did. By the early 1980s, James Whitey Bulger had everything he'd ever wanted. Control, fear, and the illusion of invincibility. Winter Hill was no longer just a gang, it was a system. Every dollar that passed through South Boston had his fingerprint somewhere on it. Politicians smiled at him, cops nodded to him, priests accepted his donations. He turned sin into a civic duty. But power, true power, has a scent. It draws attention. It breeds paranoia. It whispers in your ear at night asking, how long before they come for you? Whitey stopped trusting sleep. He began changing his routes home, his cars, his safe houses. He watched everyone, even his own men. Especially his own men. He'd built his empire on silence, but silence cuts both ways. It protects you, until it doesn't. His partner in crime, Steve the rifleman Flemmy, shared his caution but not his conscience. Together they ran rackets that touched every corner of the city, drugs, extortion, unions, informants. And through it all, the FBI kept feeding them protection. Connolly was still inside the bureau, still covering tracks, still cashing envelopes. But whispers travel fast, even through thick walls. Other agents began to notice. Why does every Italian crew we target end up dead before we get there? Why are Bulger's boys never touched? It didn't take long for suspicion to become paperwork. The files grew. Reports piled up. Something was rotting from the inside and Whitey could smell it. He'd always said, paranoia keeps you alive. But now it was eating him alive. He started showing up unannounced at his men's homes at 3 a.m., testing loyalty by seeing who flinched. He'd ask calm, casual questions. You still with me? You ever talk to anyone about me? You sleep okay these days? If the answers came too quickly, he noticed. If they hesitated, he remembered. The man who once built order was now ruled by suspicion. One night, over dinner at a quiet restaurant on Morrissey Boulevard, Flemmy said, You don't have to worry so much, Jimmy. We own this city. Whitey looked out the window, snow swirling under streetlights. No one owns anything, he said. We just rent it from fear. By the late 80s, his world was tightening. The new generation of cops wasn't as corruptible, and the FBI's top brass were changing. Connolly's protection was slipping. The Bureau began investigating its own, and when the light turned inward, it always found shadows. Then came the leak. Someone inside whispered to the press. The Boston Globe started sniffing. An article hinted that the FBI's top informant might also be its most violent criminal. It didn't name him, not yet, but it didn't have to. Everyone who knew the streets knew who they meant. Whitey's phone calls grew shorter. His meetings rarer. His smile colder. He began moving money, shifting assets, preparing for something he didn't dare say out loud. And then, the walls collapsed. In 1995, an indictment list leaked. Dozens of names. FBI moles, mobsters, corrupt cops. And there, buried deep among them, was his own. The moment Connolly saw it, he called Whitey. The conversation was short. "They're coming." "When?" "Soon." Whitey hung up without saying goodbye. He didn't need to. Within hours he was gone. No one saw him leave. No one saw him pack. He simply vanished, like smoke in winter air. His car was found days later in a parking lot, dusted with snow. Inside, a map of the United States, a few wrappers, an empty coffee cup. No fingerprints. No clues. Just absence. Boston froze. For 20 years, the man who'd ruled its underworld had disappeared without a trace. Some said he fled to Europe. Others said South America. A few swore he died and the FBI covered it up. But the truth was simpler and colder. He was hiding in plain sight. For 16 years, Whitey Bulger lived as a ghost. He took a new name, Charlie Gasco. He and his longtime girlfriend, Catherine Gregg, rented an apartment in Santa Monica, California. A small beige building near the ocean. Quiet. Ordinary. Forgettable. The neighbors described him as polite, well-dressed, soft-spoken. He fed stray cats. Paid rent on time. Helped fix the elevator when it broke. A harmless old man with kind eyes. But behind that calm, he kept weapons under the bed, cash in the walls, and binoculars by the window. Every morning he watched the street below, scanning faces, memorizing cars. Old habits never die, they calcify. He lived like a man rehearsing for the end, waiting for the knock on the door that would turn myth back into man. Sometimes he'd walk by the beach at sunset, the sky burning gold over the Pacific. People passed him without knowing who he was, the ghost of Boston, invisible in daylight. He'd listen to the waves, breathe the salt air, and think about all the men who died in his name. Did he feel guilt? Maybe. But guilt is a luxury, and Whitey never wasted money on luxuries. Back in Boston, his legend grew. Kids who'd never seen his face told stories about him, how he'd escaped the feds, how he'd killed 100 men, how he'd lived forever. The truth was quieter, lonelier, more human. He was just an old man in exile, haunted not by his crimes, but by the silence that followed them. In 2011, the ghosts finally found him. An FBI billboard went up. A reward, a face, a name. Catherine Gregg's love for animals gave them away. A neighbor recognized her from TV. The knock came one bright California morning. Whitey opened the door calmly. No fight. No words. Just a slow, measured exhale. He looked at the agents and said, "You finally figured it out." 16 years of running ended in a single breath. Back in Boston, the headlines screamed, but Whitey stayed silent. During his trial, he sat still, expressionless, listening to the families of the dead. He showed no remorse. When asked if he had anything to say, he leaned forward and said, "I'm not the monster you make me out to be. I just played the game better than the rest." He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. In prison, time finally caught him. The same paranoia that had built his empire followed him behind bars. He refused medical help, refused to talk, refused to bend. But even the coldest kings can't rule forever. In 2018, guards found him dead in his cell, beaten to death by inmates, his face unrecognizable. The man who had lived by silence died by it too. Outside, the snow was falling again, not in Boston this time, but in memory. And if you walk those streets today, you might still feel him, not as a ghost, but as a lesson. Power doesn't disappear. It just changes shape. And silence never forgets. They say the ocean remembers everything. The ships that vanish, the bodies it swallows, the secrets whispered into its tides. When the police finally came for James Whitey Bulger, it was the ocean that watched, quiet, indifferent, as if it had been waiting all along. It was June 22, 2011. The air in Santa Monica was warm and dry, the kind of morning that made people forget the rest of the world. Whitey was 71 years old, and he had been hiding in plain sight for 16 years. Inside his small, beige apartment, everything was in its place, clean, simple, controlled. The blinds were half drawn. A stack of crime novels sat by his chair. And somewhere behind the wall plaster, over $800,000 in cash slept beside 30 guns. At 8:45 a.m., a knock on the door. He opened it without hesitation. 2 FBI agents stood there, calm, professional, almost reverent. One of them had read about him as a kid. Now he was the man to end the myth. "Mr. Bulger?" Whitey looked at them for a long moment, then smiled faintly. "You found me." There was no struggle. No theatrics. He placed his hands behind his back as if rehearsed. The cuffs clicked shut like punctuation on a half-century of silence. Neighbors gathered outside as he was led down the stairs. Some gasped, some whispered. To them, he had been the quiet old man who fed cats and tipped waitresses. Now they saw the ghost for what he was. A man who had outlived almost everyone who'd ever feared him. When the story broke, Boston erupted. The headlines called it the end of the Irish King. Talk radio hosts screamed, analysts speculated, victims' families cried. But in South Boston the mood was complicated. Some cursed him. Some defended him. Others just shook their heads and said, "He was ours." At the federal courthouse the cameras waited. He was thinner now, white hair combed neatly, blue eyes still sharp. When the reporters shouted his name he didn't flinch. He just looked at the sky as if expecting snow, and said nothing. The trial began in 2013. 48 counts. 19 murders. Decades of corruption, conspiracy, betrayal. The courtroom was a theater of ghosts. Former allies testifying, widows reliving, prosecutors reading from files that smelled of dust and blood. Whitey sat still, hands folded, eyes half closed. He didn't react when they read the names of the dead. Didn't blink when they showed the photographs. To him it was just noise, the echoes of choices long made. When asked if he wanted to testify he refused. "You'll never hear the truth in this room," he said. "The truth's been buried deeper than any of those bodies." Reporters called it arrogance. Those who'd known him called it consistency. For the families, it was agony, to see the man who destroyed so much sit there calm, untouched by guilt or pity. One woman stood up and shouted, "You're the devil." Whitey turned, looked at her and said quietly, "You don't know the devil." Even the judge paused. He was convicted on 31 counts including 11 murders. 2 consecutive life sentences plus 5 years, as if time itself needed insurance. When the verdict was read he didn't move. Just nodded once as though confirming something he'd already known since the day he vanished. Prison life suited him in strange ways. The structure, the silence, the endless repetition. He woke early, ate little, read constantly. Other inmates gave him space. They called him Old Man Southey. Some sought advice, others sought status just by sitting near him. He wrote letters, to Catherine, to friends, even to journalists. His handwriting was clean, deliberate, almost elegant. In one letter he said, "They call this justice. I call it bookkeeping. They tally sins like they tally debts and forget who taught them to count." But beneath the discipline age was winning. His back bent, his hands trembled. The fire in his eyes dimmed but never went out. The guard said he never begged, never complained. Only once did he ask a question. "How's the weather in Boston?" The guard said, "Cold." Whitey smiled. "Good." He was moved from prison to prison, his name still too dangerous to stay in one place. Each transfer felt like a ghost changing graves. By 2018 he was 79 and frail, his body failing faster than his mind. He joked to a nurse, "Maybe they'll bury me in the snow where I belong." That October morning they sent him to Hazleton Penitentiary in West Virginia, a rough place full of men who didn't forget headlines. Less than 24 hours later, before dawn, the guards found him slumped in his wheelchair, his face beaten beyond recognition. No witnesses. No noise. No cameras. Just silence. The autopsy listed the cause as blunt force trauma. But those who knew the life he'd led called it something else, inevitable. When the news hit, Boston fell quiet. Not out of mourning but out of something more complicated. Fear doesn't disappear when its source dies. It lingers, like frost in the bones of a city that's seen too much. His brother Billy didn't speak to reporters. Catherine wept in silence. And the streets he once ruled kept moving, indifferent, as if trying to forget. In Southey the snow came early that year. It fell soft and gray, blanketing the rooftops, the alleyways, the bars. A few old men in a corner pub lifted their glasses. One said, "He should have died here." Another replied, "He already did." And somewhere far away in the wind that swept across the harbor, you could almost hear it, that faint, familiar whisper of control. Whitey Bulger was gone. But the idea of him, the lesson he represented, remained. That power without conscience doesn't build empires. It builds prisons so large even the kings can't escape them. The man who thought he'd beaten time ended up exactly where every story like his must go. Into the dark, into the silence, into the part of history that refuses to close its eyes. The earth in Corleone was the color of old blood, red, cracked, and dry. The sun didn't shine there, it punished. It baked the stones, blinded the hills, and burned the faces of the boys who worked the fields until their dreams peeled like skin. Among those boys was a quiet child with black eyes and a stare too still for his age. His name was Salvatore Riina, though no one called him that. They called him Toto Curto, Toto the Short One. He was born in 1930, in a land that belonged more to silence than to the law. Sicily even then was its own country, ruled by poverty, pride, and whispers. The men in suits from Palermo talked of governments, taxes, progress. The men in black hats from Corleone talked of survival. Between them lay the mafia, Cosa Nostra, our thing. Not written, not spoken, but known. Toto's father was a laborer, a man of the soil. He worked the limestone quarries, sometimes the vineyards, sometimes whatever would put bread on the table. One afternoon, when Toto was 13, his father was killed trying to steal gunpowder from a construction site, a desperate act for desperate times. The explosion blew apart the man and the family he left behind. From that day on, the boy learned the first rule of Corleone. The world doesn't pity hunger. It buries it. He left school. He began moving in the orbit of older boys who carried knives and spoke in code. They didn't shout. They didn't smile. They moved like ghosts between the olive trees, doing errands for men whose names were never written. Messages. Deliveries. Watching. Always watching. The post-war years came, chaos and opportunity. Sicily was poor, but its soil grew things the rest of the world wanted. Lemons, olives, wheat, and power. The black market was blooming. Men with nothing became men with guns. And the guns gave them everything. Toto Riina was patient. He didn't rush. He learned how the old dons operated, calm, respectful, but never weak. They spoke softly, killed rarely, and always with reason. But Toto looked at them and thought, reason is for men who can afford mercy. In 1949, at 19, he joined the mafia for real. The initiation was ancient, almost religious. A saint's image burned in his palm as he swore the oath. If I betray, may my flesh burn as this paper burns. He didn't flinch. The others noticed. In that stillness they saw something, not courage exactly but an absence of fear. The first time he killed, it was quiet. A rival's nephew. A message for someone else. They found the body in the lemon grove, face down among the thorns. When the older men asked how he felt, he said, it's like working the land. You dig, you cover, you move on. They laughed then, not realizing they were laughing at prophecy. The 1950s were good years for the mafia. They controlled construction, banks, politics. Every mayor had a patron, every patron had a priest. Corleone, once a forgotten town, became the beating heart of something darker. But within the hierarchy, the old bosses were getting soft. They enjoyed their wine, their cigars, their rules. Toto watched, waiting. He wasn't interested in the ceremonies, the hand-kissing, the talk of honor. To him, honor was a story men told to make violence look noble. He saw power as something simpler, control through fear. By 30, he'd begun gathering his own circle, men loyal not to tradition but to him. They called themselves the Corleonesi. They weren't from Palermo, didn't attend the meetings of the noble families. They stayed quiet, out of sight, building strength like wrought under wood. At night, Toto would sit outside his small stone house, watching the hills darken. The cicadas hummed, the air smelled of lemons and gun oil. He'd think of his father's explosion, of the hunger, of the years spent unseen. He'd think one day they'll all look up, and they'll see me. And in that thought, something irreversible was born. A conviction. A destiny. A beast. He began eliminating rivals one by one, quietly, efficiently. A car bomb here. A shot at a wedding there. Always from the shadows, never with witnesses. Bodies found in fields, in rivers, under bridges. The police wrote reports. The priests gave blessings. And life in Sicily went on because death was part of it. The old bosses dismissed him. The little man from Corleone, they said. He doesn't understand the code. They were right. He didn't. He was writing a new one. One built not on respect, but on obedience. Not on family, but on fear. And soon, every man in Palermo, every judge, every cop, every politician would learn to pronounce his name with the same care one uses when handling a loaded gun. Salvatore Riina, Toto the Short One, was no longer a child of dust and lemons. He was the child of silence. And silence in Sicily was power. There are summers in Sicily when the air itself feels like punishment, heavy, humming, waiting for something to burn. In those years, the 1970s through the 1980s, the island burned not from the sun, but from a man. A short man with calm eyes and a voice that never rose above a whisper. Salvatore Toto Riina had risen. From Corleone's forgotten hills, he had crawled his way to the throne of Cosa Nostra, the mafia's mafia. He did it the only way he knew how, by erasing anyone who stood between him and absolute control. They called him La Belva, the beast. Not because he was wild but because he was relentless. He didn't roar, he consumed. At first the other bosses laughed at him. He was crude, provincial, without manners. But laughter in Sicily is a dangerous thing, it carries your name to the wrong ears. And soon, one by one, the men who mocked him began to disappear. Some died in their cars. Some never came home from dinner. Some were found with their mouths full of dust, hands folded neatly across their chests, as if the earth itself had chosen to keep their secrets. Riina's war began quietly, a few gunshots at night, a few names crossed off ledgers. But like all fires, it spread. By 1981, Sicily was at war with itself. The Corleonesi Riina's faction moved through Palermo like a storm. He targeted not only rivals but anyone who might one day think of becoming one. Bosses, judges, police chiefs, politicians. No one was beyond reach. The streets of Palermo turned into a chessboard of blood. Cars exploded outside cafes. Bodies appeared in trunks, in vineyards, in the blue sea that lapped against the island's golden shores. To the world it looked like chaos. To Riina it was order. He called it cleaning. Cleaning the organization. Cleaning the island. Cleaning the noise. Those who worked for him learned fast. Mercy was not a word that existed in his language. A betrayal didn't need to be proven, only suspected. And suspicion alone could cost you your life, your family, your lineage. There was a story, whispered, always whispered, about a lieutenant who once questioned one of Riina's orders. Riina invited him to dinner. They ate. They drank. When the man stood to leave, Riina put a hand on his shoulder and said, "Sit. I haven't finished my wine." Minutes later the man was dead. No shouting. No warning. Just stillness. Power, Riina believed, was not about fear. It was about inevitability. When people believe you can't be stopped, they stop trying. By the early 1980s, he had done the unthinkable. United the Sicilian mafia under one hand. The old bosses were gone. The new ones bent the knee. Even the politicians, those men in dark suits who pretended not to see, began sending messages through intermediaries. "What do you want? What do you need?" He smiled at that. Not because he wanted their help, but because he wanted them to know they were already too late. But there was one enemy he couldn't control, the law itself. Judges Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino, men of principle, of reason, began to hunt him. They built cases, compiled testimonies, cracked codes. They called it the Maxi trial, the largest prosecution of organized crime in Italian history. Riina watched from the shadows. Hundreds of mafiosi were convicted. But the man behind it all, La Belva, remained invisible. To him, justice was a noise far away, an echo he could silence at will. And in 1992 he did. It was May 23, 5:58 p.m. A stretch of highway near Capaci. Judge Giovanni Falcone was driving home with his wife and security detail. Underneath the road, buried deep in the asphalt, was half a ton of explosives. When the convoy passed, the ground itself rose in a scream. Cars lifted. Glass turned to sand. The judge, his wife, and his guards, gone in an instant. The world stopped breathing. The news rippled across Italy, across oceans. The mafia had declared war on the state. 2 months later, Paolo Borsellino followed, a car bomb outside his mother's home. The message was clear: there are no saints in Sicily. Only survivors. But the explosions that made him infamous also began his end. For the first time the people turned. The silence that had protected him began to crack. Children drew chalk hearts on the streets where the judges had died. Crowds gathered, shouting words Sicily hadn't spoken in a century: "Basta. Enough." Riina didn't care. He told his men, "The people shout today. Tomorrow they'll whisper again." But tomorrow came faster than he expected. By late 1993 his empire was unraveling. Alliances crumbled. Informants defected. Even the most loyal lieutenants began to sense what he never could: that fear has an expiration date. Still he slept soundly. He believed in his own myth. He believed the silence of the island would protect him as it always had. For 24 years he'd ruled from the shadows, untouchable, unseen, unpunished. Until one January morning in Palermo the silence broke. They came for him in the early hours, police cars, sirens low, tires whispering against cobblestones. He was in a small house on Via Bernini, living under a false name. When the door burst open he looked up from his breakfast, expression blank. One officer later said, he didn't look surprised. Just annoyed. As they cuffed him he asked one question. Who betrayed me? No one answered. They didn't need to. The island had. That night in Palermo it rained. For the first time in decades, the thunder sounded louder than the bombs. And for the first time, Sicily slept without fear. But even then, in the hush between storms, some swore they could hear it. The faint rhythm of footsteps on dry soil. The ghost of a man who believed he could rule forever. La Belva. The beast of Sicily. Finally in a cage. Palermo, 1993. The sun hadn't risen yet when the convoy stopped in front of the small yellow house on Via Bernini. The street was silent, the kind of silence that only exists before history changes. Inside, Salvatore Toto, Riina sat at his kitchen table, buttering a piece of bread, reading the morning paper like any other retired man. There were no guards, no guns, no shadows moving in the corners, just the hum of an old refrigerator and the faint smell of coffee. The door broke first. Then the shouts came. Polizia. Money in alto. He didn't move. Didn't reach for the gun beside him. He simply looked up and smiled. When they cuffed him, he said one sentence, soft as breath. You found me, eh? It only took you half a lifetime. He was 63. For 24 years, he had ruled the island from underground, untouched by law, surrounded by blood. And yet, as they led him out into the pale Sicilian morning, he looked not like a monster, but like a farmer heading to work. Neighbors watched from windows. A few crossed themselves. Others whispered, it's him. You capo di tutti I capi, the boss of all bosses. When the car doors slammed, a long sigh passed through Palermo, the kind of sound a city makes when it finally exhales after decades of holding its breath. The trial was a spectacle, glass cages, microphones, translators, hundreds of witnesses. But Riina refused to speak. He sat in silence, eyes lowered, hands folded in front of him like a priest at confession. When the prosecutors listed the murders, 150 names and counting, he smiled. Not with pride but with pity. As if he were listening to children describe a storm they could never understand. One day a journalist shouted, "Do you feel remorse?" Riina turned his head, slow and deliberate. "Remorse," he said, "is for those who lost. I didn't lose. I was replaced." The courtroom froze. He was sentenced to multiple life terms, so many that even the judges stopped counting. Life stacked upon life, punishment upon punishment, eternity written into law. He bowed slightly like a man accepting an award. Then came the real punishment, silence. Solitary confinement. A cell no larger than 6 steps by 3. Concrete walls, a steel door, a single barred window that showed only sky. In prison time moved differently. Days blurred. Seasons became rumors. The only clock was his own heartbeat. He woke at dawn, prayed, ate, waited. Sometimes he talked to the guards, not with arrogance but curiosity. He'd ask about the world outside, about football scores, about the weather in Palermo. When they asked if he missed his home, he said, "Home was never a place. It was control." Years passed. His hair turned white, his body shrank, but his eyes never softened. Even behind bars he gave orders, small ones coded through lawyers, through wives of old soldiers. The network still pulsed faintly, like a dying heart refusing to stop. But Sicily was changing. The silence that had protected him was breaking. Younger mafiosi no longer kissed rings or spoke in whispers. They texted. They traded fear for profit. The age of omerta, the sacred vow of silence, was ending, replaced by greed and noise. Riina watched from his cell as television flickered in the hallway, news of arrests, betrayals, defectors. The world he built was dissolving. And yet he didn't rage. He just murmured, "They never understood. Fear is not cruelty. Fear is order." When his wife visited, he spoke little. He asked about the children, about the old house in Corleone, about the lemon trees. He never mentioned the dead. Never the trials. Never the blood. She once said to him, "Salvatore, they call you a monster." He smiled faintly. "Then I taught them something." By the late 2000s, age had finally done what bullets could not. His kidneys failed. His hands trembled. The guards began treating him more like a relic than a threat. When they rolled his wheelchair through the corridors, other prisoners fell silent, not out of respect but out of habit, the way you go quiet at a funeral. In his final months he prayed more. Not for forgiveness but for legacy. He wanted the world to remember the order he had forced upon chaos, the discipline within his violence. One priest, brave or foolish, asked him during confession, "Do you fear God?" Riina chuckled softly. "No, Father. God fears men who build kingdoms on earth." He died on November 17, 2017, in a prison hospital in Parma. 87 years old. The last of the old dons. His final words were to his wife on the phone, Come ti amo tanto. I love you so much. Then his breath stopped. Outside, rain fell on the old stones of Palermo, washing away the dust but not the memory. The city didn't mourn him. But it didn't celebrate either. It just went on, as it always had, quietly. Some say that on nights when the wind rolls down from the mountains, you can still hear the bells of Corleone echo through the valleys. Not as mourning. As warning. Because men like Riina don't die in full. They linger in habits, in fears, in the silence they once commanded. The beast was gone. But the silence he taught Sicily, that careful, obedient quiet, would take generations to unlearn. There's a kind of silence that only comes after an empire dies. It's not peace. It's the sound of ghosts rearranging themselves. Harlem, Boston, Sicily, 3 places that never met, 3 worlds divided by oceans and skin and language, all tied together by one truth. Power never sleeps. It only waits for the next man willing to pay its price. In Harlem the jazz faded. The sidewalks that once echoed with laughter and rhythm are quieter now. The men in sharp suits are gone, the smoke from Small's Paradise long dissolved into the night. But if you stand near 125th Street when the rain begins to fall, you might still feel it. The weight of an invisible gaze, the calm authority of a man who ruled without shouting. Bumpy Johnson, the gentleman gangster. He tried to shape chaos into elegance to make power look like civility. He believed he could protect Harlem from itself. And maybe for a time he did. But the truth about kings is this: the throne doesn't save anyone. It just changes the kind of loneliness they feel. He died quietly mid-conversation with a plate of shrimp and grits before him, and somehow that made sense. Because his story was never about how it ended. It was about how long he managed to balance grace and sin without falling. Far north, the snow still gathers on the roofs of South Boston. The pubs are warm, the streets cleaner now, but the fear, that specific kind of fear, still hums underneath the bricks. Whitey Bulger built his empire in the cold. He made silence his currency and paranoia his religion. He outsmarted everyone, until he outsmarted himself. He thought hiding would make him free. But exile is just another kind of prison, one where your warden is memory. They found him beaten in his cell, face unrecognizable, body small and fragile. For a man who spent his life controlling fear, in the end, fear controlled him. Maybe he knew that. Maybe that's why, on his last day in Santa Monica, he fed the stray cats and looked out at the Pacific, the ocean he'd never cross again. Perhaps he already understood what men like him always learned too late. When you build your kingdom on fear, the ghosts always come to collect. And then, across the sea, the island of Sicily sleeps under its eternal sun. The air smells of lemons and old gunpowder. The roads are quiet again, the churches open their doors without flinching. But in Corleone the hills still hold their breath. Salvatore Toto Riina, La Belva. He wanted not wealth, not fame, but obedience. He believed that if you make men afraid enough, the world becomes simple. For a while he was right. Even God seemed to hesitate before him. But time doesn't fear anyone. And when it came for Riina, it didn't roar, it whispered. A cold cell. A rain-soaked morning. A final phone call to the only person who still said his name with love. The beast died quietly like every man before him, leaving behind not honor, not victory, just silence. 3 kings. 3 crowns. 3 different kinds of darkness. Bumpy sought control through dignity. Whitey through deceit. Riina through terror. Each believed their way was right. Each believed they were smarter than fate. And each ended alone, surrounded not by friends or enemies but by echoes. The weight of power is not the gold it brings or the blood it costs. It's the silence that follows when the noise is gone, the silence that asks, was it worth it? Maybe that's why we still tell their stories. Not to glorify them, but to understand the part of us that still envies them. Because deep down, every listener, every dreamer, every tired soul lying in the dark knows the truth. We all crave control. Over our lives. Over our fears. Over the chaos that keeps us awake. And in that craving, maybe we're not so different from the kings of Harlem, Boston, and Sicily. We just choose smaller empires to rule, our homes, our jobs, our hearts. Soft jazz fades in. Then a low hum like wind over distant streets. Close your eyes now. Let the ghosts go. Let Harlem's horns fade, Boston's snowfall, Sicily's sunset. Because tonight there are no gangsters. No kings. Only you and the quiet between heartbeats. Sleep well. History will keep their names. You don't have to.